Hey everyone, Thyworm here with more League Start tips in solo self-found with the third episode, Vendor Recipes. I'm going over all sorts of useful vendor recipes during League Start and Atlas progression and endgame in this video, so stay tuned. Let's first quickly explain what vendor recipes are, because the game does a terrible job at it. Vendor recipes are basically recipes for combinations of items that you sell to any vendor within the game, and in return you get a predetermined result. They give you something back and it's always the same. The concept is very simple, however, knowing all the recipes is not. That just comes with experience and from watching videos like this one. This video doesn't aim to be exhaustive, there are many more recipes, but I find most of those so niche that for SSF it is not really all that useful. Some of the things I omitted from the video I'm sure are debatable, like a Vile Orb, a +1 weapon or the bloody Chaos recipe, but I do believe that once you have the materials for those vendor recipes, you don't really have a need for those vendor recipes anymore. At least I always feel that way at that stage in the game. Let's start with some recipes you would primarily use during the campaign. At the very start, you are likely in need of wisdom scrolls. Selling a blacksmith whetstone, an alteration orb or a transmutation orb all provide 4 wisdom scrolls. Selling an armorer's scrap provides 2 wisdom scrolls. However, be very mindful of selling these currencies because you need them later down the line in the campaign to buy skill gems, for example, especially at League Start, and an alteration orb is worth much more than 4 wisdom scrolls in that regard. More currency you can get using vendor recipes, in particular Chromatic Orbs. This is incredibly useful if you have a 3-link or a 4-link item early on with the wrong socket colors. You can try to get the right ones using a Chromatic Orb. The vendor recipe for a Chromatic Orb is any item with 3 linked sockets using 3 different colors, so blue, green and red all linked. Your typical loot filter shows these items as well. Also very useful during the campaign, especially with the melee league coming up, is the vendor recipe for either increased spell damage or increased physical damage. Both follow the same concept. For increased spell damage, you need a magic intelligence-based weapon, like a wand, a blacksmith whetstone, and a chain belt of any rarity. But that rarity matters. The rarer the belt is, the higher the increased spell damage roll. You can see here that a magic belt rolls tier 8 and a rare belt rolls tier 7. The same is true for increased physical damage. You need a strength-based weapon, a blacksmith whetstone and a rustic sash of any rarity, but the rarer the belt, the better the increased physical damage roll. There are a few things you should keep in mind. The weapon needs to be of magic rarity, first of all. And the weapon's mods will reroll entirely with a guaranteed spell damage or physical damage roll. Because the power of melee skills, especially since Settlers of Kalgur is dependent on the base damage of your weapons, it's very important to make sure you keep using weapons with more base damage and then increase that damage with this vendor recipe. You're welcome. On to rings. What can help a lot in Act 1 and Act 2 is some initial resistances, especially for the boss fights. Act 1 has Merveil, which does a lot of cold damage. Act 2 has the Vile Oversoul, I think he's called, that does a lot of lightning damage. And a good way to get some early resistances is using rings. You can use vendor recipes to create those rings by combining an iron ring with a certain color skill gem or support gem. Combine it with red and it turns into a ruby ring for fire resistance. Combine it with green and it turns into a topaz ring, providing lightning resistance. And combine it with blue to get a sapphire ring, providing cold resistance. You do get white rings, but for these boss fights, the resistances really are a game changer. You can do the same with amulets. A jade amulet, which gives dexterity, plus a lapis amulet, which gives intelligence, plus an orb of transmutation, results in a turquoise amulet, which gives both dexterity and intelligence. Same thing for a jade and amber amulet. The latter provides strength, so the result is a citrine amulet, giving dexterity and strength. And the last one is lapis and amber, resulting in an agate amulet for strength and intelligence. It's worth noting that the result takes on the rarity of both amulets it's made out of. So if you combine magic amulets, the result is also a magic amulet. And just for completeness sake, if you want an Onyx amulet, which provides all attributes, you can vendor any amulet, a red, green and blue gem, and the result is an Onyx amulet. This is not very useful in the campaign, but we will come back to this recipe later. We move on to flasks, which you tend to find plenty of. You can combine 3 of the same flask into a flask of a higher tier. Please be aware, however, that this does raise the level requirement typically, so make sure once you do this you can actually wear the new flask. And this 3-to-1 concept, meaning that you trade 3 items and you get 1 in return, will return later in this video as well. Let's talk about early endgame or early maps vendor recipes. I've gathered a few, starting with more 3-to-1 recipes, but this time it is maps. You can also vendor 3 maps of the same tier and it will turn into a map that is 1 tier higher. This works until tier 16, by the way. You can mix and match several maps and you will get different outcomes. There's no real rhyme or reason to these things that I can explain right now, but you'll just have to experiment a little bit to get the maps you want for your Atlas progression. Circling back to some more currency, you're now at the stage of the game where you will find items with 6 sockets and maybe even 6 links. You can vendor an item with 6 sockets for 7 jeweler orbs. Not sure why it's not 6, which would make a lot more sense, but okay. And you can vendor a 6-link item for 20 orbs of fusing. If you managed to find a Divine Orb, which in Solar Self-Found has limited value compared to trade, you might want to use that Divine Orb with 5 normal flasks to create 5 Divine Vessels. Divine Vessels can be incredibly rare during League Start scenarios and you need them to get your Pantheon powers. 5 is a good starting point. This is a super useful SSF vendor recipe. In trade you should never really use this. There's a bit more currency that is quite useful, and those are Enkindling and Instilling Orbs, primarily the latter because they can automate your flasks. I think the drop rate for these are typically the same, but unless you have a niche setup, you always want Instilling Orbs, not Enkindling Orbs. You can get Instilling Orbs by vendoring 2 Enkindling Orbs, any skill gem with the trigger tag, so Bane here has a trigger tag, and an Orb of Alchemy. This gives 1 Instilling Orb. Should you for whatever reason require Enkindling Orbs instead, you can vendor 4 Instilling Orbs, again a trigger gem and an Orb of Scouring. Let's talk about gems. You can vendor a level 20 support gem and not a skill gem, together with a Gem Cutter's Prism to receive a level 1 support gem with 20 quality. This is the way to improve the quality of your gems in Solar Self-Found until much later when you gathered tons of Gem Cutter's Prisms. Similarly, you can vendor any gem with 20% quality, including skill gems, to receive a Gem Cutter's Prism. Finally, some late game recipes, some of which I didn't even know myself and I found out through this research for the video. First, let's get you some more of these 3-to-1 or even 5-to-1 recipes. You can vendor 3 Scarabs and you get a random Scarab in return. You will get most common Scarabs a lot more often than the rare ones, so in that sense it follows the Scarab's drop rate. You can also vendor 3 of the same uniques to get that unique in return, but then just a new one. The most common use cases are unique items that have a wide range of stats that they can roll, like the Venter's Gamble. You'll pick these up either way, also in a new league, but they're typically not all that good. But as soon as you've got 3 of them, which suck, you can vendor those and maybe get a new one that's much better. You can vendor 5-to-1 as well. If 3-to-1 doesn't work, add 2 more of the same item and chances are it does work now. For example, with Inscribed Ultimatums. Try to vendor 3 and really nothing happens. Try to vendor 5 and you get a random one in return. This occasionally comes in handy, but I hardly ever use a 5-to-1 recipe, to be honest. Alright, now we go into some fancy stuff, starting with uniques. There are some uniques, only a few really, which you can only acquire using vendor recipes. And I'm showing you 2 of those, because I have these lying around at the moment. If you vendor all of the 3 barracks rings, which look alike and all start with the name barrack, you get the Taming in return. A very powerful ring with great stats and great damage if you happen to inflict a bunch of ailments. Another interesting unique you get by fusing together a Feast Bind, a Famine Bind and an Orb of Fusing, which turns into a new belt, the Wretch. I've never really seen this belt being used in a build, but yeah, it is a cool interaction for sure. So you remember that Onyx Amulet recipe? Any amulet, a red, blue and green skill gem? Well, this vendor recipe also works on influenced items, or influenced amulets in this case, and the result is still an influenced amulet. What this allows you to do, basically, is transfer the influence from a bad amulet, like the one that has rarity, to at least a more useful one, an Onyx amulet that has attributes, while still keeping the influence. And influenced amulets are very strong because they can roll an additional +1 level of skill gems affix depending on which amulets they are, and they can also roll all sorts of other affixes that you will not find on regular amulets. In this case, it is an amulet from Al Hasmin, the poison guy, and this amulet can roll +1 to chaos skill gems. These are very powerful amulets, especially for crafting. We're finishing strong with the blast and more amulets, because this one blew my mind a little bit. There is an amulet called an Astrolabe or Astrolabe, which is an amulet from Heist. It's quite rare. I found one, however, this league, and using the same vendor recipe, so this amulet, a green, blue and a red gem, you turn it again into an Onyx amulet, but now it randomized the 2 influence and provides an Onyx amulet with not 1 but 2 influences. Depending on the ones that you get, it is potentially incredibly strong. And I think it's also incredibly cool that something like this even exists in the game. And these are all the vendor recipes that I could find that stood out to me and that I use quite often. Also that I think are very useful in Solo Self-Found. If you know of more Solo Self-Found recipes that should absolutely be on the list, feel free to share it in the comments. As long as it's not a chaos recipe. I want my viewers to actually enjoy the game. I hope you try out these vendor recipes, let me know what you think. Also, let me know if you have any suggestions for new videos now that the league is coming up. Subscribe and like for more PoE SSF content. Thanks for watching and making it to the end. Love you all, see you soon, bye bye.